Hello, everyone. I am Barbara Parker. I have the privilege of being president of the UC San Diego Emeriti Association this year. And it's my pleasure today, as a part of the Emeriti Association Video Legacy Project, to interview Dr. Sonia Israel, who is an Emerita Professor of Department of Psychiatry at UC San Diego. Dr. Israel, or Sonia, welcome. Thank you so much.
Or Dr. Ancoli-Israel.
Dr. Ancoli-Israel, Sonia Ancoli-Israel. Sonia, please, we'd like to welcome you and thank you so much for participating in our project. The goal is to interview leaders at UC San Diego who have had accomplished careers, to understand their accomplishments, to understand how the university was many years ago and how it has changed over time, to understand their role models, to understand their contributions, and importantly, to understand any lessons learned for the next generation of faculty. So with that introduction, Dr. Ancoli-Israel, or Sonia, I'd like to start out by asking you to briefly describe your personal biography. Where were you born? What was your family like? What was it like growing up? And then how did you enter a career of research?
Well, that could take an hour right there. First of all, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for including me in what I think is a really important project. I'm a real believer, and we always have to know where we came from to know where we're going. So I think this is great. I was born in Israel to parents who were Holocaust survivors. They went to Israel right after World War II. My father actually worked for the Israeli government. And when I was 3, he was sent to New York to work in the consulate and the UN there. And we ended up staying. He left the government. We ended up staying in New York. So I grew up basically in New York City. We had a very close-knit family. I have one sister. Most of our family was lost in the war. Each of my parents had one sibling, and they had their own set of kids, but they all lived in Israel. But we were a small family, so we were all very, very close. Let's see. I loved growing up in New York, lots of culture. My parents would take us to the symphony and the ballet and plays and opera, so we got lots of exposure to culture. My mother was a microbiologist. My father was a CPA. So math, science was always sort of a part of my life, and I always loved it. My sister was more of the creative side. She was a pianist. She went to Juilliard. She went to the High School of Music and Art, which I think now is called the High School of Performing Arts. And of course, I wanted to follow in her first steps, so I applied to music and art, but I also applied to Bronx Science, the Bronx High School of Science. And I didn't get into music and art because I'm really not that talented, but I did get into Bronx Science. And when I got the acceptance letter, I started crying. And my mother said, "Oh, sweetheart, you know, it's okay if you didn't get in." And I said, "No, I did get in." And I realized, I think at that moment, how much science was important to me, how much I really loved science. I can't say that was the start of my career, but maybe the start of my realization of what I could be passionate about. So after science, I went to Stony Brook, State University of New York at Stony Brook, which I think has also changed its name. I think it's now Stony Brook University, where I did actually follow my sister's footsteps. She went there as well. I majored in psychology. I started out as a bio major, didn't like chemistry so much, became a math major, and eventually made my way to psychology, which was really meant for me. While I was there, I think in my sophomore year, my resident assistant, Pat Cowings, was doing research with Dr. Lester Femi in alpha biofeedback. And she asked me if I wanted to help them with their researches. That was my first exposure to research. My first study, my first published abstract, was doing alpha brainwave biofeedback research. So that was really what got me started. From there, I applied to PhD programs, but way back then, this was a long time ago, it was very hard for women to get into clinical psychology programs, which is sort of ironic because these days the majority of students are women. So when I didn't get in anywhere, I decided I'd go for a master's first. And at that point, the only schools that hadn't reached their deadlines were the California state schools. And my sister actually was living in LA at that point. So I applied and I got into the California State University at Long Beach. And I went there to do a master's. And while there, I created a program for myself with Dr. Kenneth Green, who was a psychophysiologist. Really, biofeedback is part of psychophysiology. And I did my master's thesis in biofeedback. Can't remember the title, something about determining how authoritarian someone is through their brainwaves and their ability to control their brainwaves. So while I was at Long Beach, it was Yom Kippur, one of the most holy Jewish holidays. But I heard that Dr. Joe Kamiya was going to be speaking at UCLA. Joe was the grandfather of the field of biofeedback. And I thought, oh my God, how can I not go hear him? I think God will forgive me. And I drove up to LA from Long Beach. And before Joe started speaking, I went up to talk to him because I had worked with Les Femi at Stony Brook and it was a small field. Everybody knew each other. So I went and I talked to him about that for a while. He starts his talk and the first thing he says is, can anyone give me a ride back to the airport? Now I was going that way anyway, but even if I hadn't been, I would have taken him. So I raised my hand. And on the way back, on the way to the airport, he said, so what's your plan after you finish your master's? And I said, I want to get a PhD and I want to come work with you. He said, great. And that's what happened. I went to UCSF. He was up at University of California, San Francisco. And I did my doctorate up there with him and with Dr. Paul Ekman, who was famous for facial recognition, emotions versus facial recognition. Yeah, so while at UCSF, as part of getting our degree, we had to pick 4 areas of specialization. I was working within psychophysiology, so of course, one of the areas was sleep. And I studied with Dr. Bob Feinberg, also one of the founders of our field, who's no longer with us, and that's what was my first exposure to sleep and studying sleep. At the time, I was in a long...
If I could interject.
Yeah, am I going too long?
No, not at all. I mean, this is all fascinating. You said that psychology spoke to you early on in college. What do you mean by that?
I loved studying the brain. I mean, I think had I gone to medical school, I would have been a neurologist, still wanting to do the same things I'm doing, but I loved the brain. I loved understanding the brain, both of the physiology of it and the psychology of it, emotions and thoughts, and, it controls everything. It all comes down to the brain. So I think that's what really spoke to me.
So you got your PhD at UCSF, and then what happened after that?
So I was in a long distance relationship with Andy Israel. We decided we should live in the same city. He was training. He was he was doing his internship and residency here down at UCSD. He was originally from California and had moved down here. And so I decided I needed to move down to San Diego so we could see what it's like to actually live in the same city. And I came down and I was still actually finishing my dissertation. So for the first year, I commuted up to Long Beach and taught up there. I taught a class in psychophysiology. But then when I graduated, I went looking for a position. And to make the story a little shorter, I went to visit Dr. Dan Kripke at UCSD. He was in the psychiatry department. He was in the VA, but really was a UCSD employee. So I went to see Dan and he looked at my background. I already had some publications. And he said, well, I don't have any money, but I have a phone and a desk. So back then there was no money, but there was space. Now, of course, there's no money and no space. That's the difference. He gave me a desk. He said, write a grant. And just at that time, the NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, had come out with an RFA for applications on sleep and aging. This is now around 1980. We knew almost nothing about sleep and aging. I wrote a grant, it got funded, and as they say, the rest is history. I'm now considered one of the world's experts on sleep and aging, but I really think it's because I was one of the first to start studying it. So I've had more time to do it than others. But so that's how it all began, and that's how I ended up at UCSD.
Wonderful, wonderful. What was the campus like at that time? What was the community like? And what was the status of sleep research when you initially were recruited by Dan Kripke?
Yeah. I have to say I wasn't really recruited. I talked my way in, you know, but wasn't the traditional recruitment path. It was obviously much smaller. This was the early 1980s. It was a baby campus. You know, very few buildings, or a lot less than there are now. Tighter community because there were fewer people. You know, I was new, so I didn't know a lot of the faculty at the beginning, and took a while to really become a part of the university. But the sleep community was small. It was primarily Dan. There were a couple pulmonologists, Stu Men, Jack Clausen, who were more learning about sleep from Dan than they were just starting to learn about it and to see patients. I actually helped train some of them. So it was a very small community. The next, if I'm remembering correctly, the next major sleep person to come to UCSD was Chris Gillen. Chris was also one of the founders of our field. He had been at NIMH for many years, and he came to San Diego. And we got to work together, which was great. He wasn't officially my mentor, but working with him was just spectacular. So then it was, you know, the three of us. I was still very junior. It was Dan and Chris. And then slowly we started getting more postdocs, more students. As I became a faculty member, and I was part of the joint doctoral program in clinical psychology, so I was able to bring in my own graduate students. And it slowly grew. And then some of our students became faculty members, like Sean Drummond, and others, right? So it grew. And then Chris passed away, Dan retired, I retired. I mean, this is now, we're talking 12 years ago, right? And Sean moved to Australia, and suddenly there was, in psychiatry, almost no sleep. There were a few people doing it, but they weren't really sleep people. But we had recruited, pulmonary medicine had recruited Dr. Atul Malhotra, and he brought in a lot of people, and sleep really moved into the pulmonary division, which has really happened all over the country, maybe all over the world, because sleep apnea became the big thing, and it's a pulmonary related sleep disorder. So while people in Atul's lab do non-pulmonary things as well, and non-sleep apnea, it is mostly sleep apnea. And I'm lucky enough to be able to continue collaborating with them. For a while, I continued seeing patients in the sleep medicine clinic that Atul was running. So it was nice because of them coming in, the sleep world within UCSD grew again. It's actually much bigger now than it ever was when it was in psychiatry.
Do you want to elaborate a little bit more about your contributions in the area of sleep apnea and aging and Alzheimer's?
Sure. So that first grant that got funded was to look at the prevalence of sleep apnea and periodic limb movements and sleep in the older adult. Had never been done. Nobody knew. We were starting to understand how common it was in younger adults. So even that was very, very new work. We thought we were doing an epidemiological study. Little did we know what real epidemiology was. Several years later, we got real epidemiologists into the field. We studied 600 people. They studied 10,000, right? So we learned, but we were the first. We were the first to do a large study and to show that sleep apnea is a incredibly common in older adults, 60%. And that was later confirmed in other studies, but we were the first to show that. So over half of older adults, which we defined as over 65, had sleep apnea. And it was a cult. Most older adults don't know they have it because they don't present in the same way. They're not necessarily obese the way younger adults are. So that was pretty important. We also showed how it's still more common in men than women, but the prevalence went way up in older women, postmenopausal women compared to younger women. So as part of that, no, not as part of that, but at that time, Dr. Elizabeth Barrett Connor was putting in a grant. It was called a teaching nursing home grant. There was this whole program for TNH studies. And she asked me if I wanted to write have a project within that on sleep in nursing homes. And so that started me in that line of research. And we also, we looked at prevalence of sleep apnea, but we also looked at what does sleep look like in a nursing home population. And we used, actually in both those studies, we used something called an actigraph, which had not really been used before. So we weren't one of the first to do that. An actigraph is a device that looks, these days it looks like a watch and it's digital. Back then it was analog, and it was like this box that was worn on a wrist connected to an analog tape recorder, and it measured wrist movement. And we showed that from that wrist movement, we can tell if someone was awake or asleep. We obviously couldn't tell sleep stages, but it was enough to know if they were awake or asleep to understand how disrupted sleep might be in the nursing home. We also recorded respiration on the same analog tape recorder. We would then take the tapes and play them back on the polygraph the way one would if one were doing an overnight sleep study. And we did 600 recordings that way. What we found was that sleep is incredibly disruptive in the nursing home, that patients with dementia were constantly falling asleep and waking up and falling asleep and waking up throughout the 24-hour day. There was never a full hour in 24 hours that they were fully asleep or fully awake. That's how disrupted the sleep-wake cycle was. And so the next question I asked was, well, we know that light therapy works really well for improving sleep. What if we give light therapy, improve the amount of light, increase the amount of light these nursing home patients were getting? And the reason that was so important is because I visited many nursing homes and we recorded light levels, and these patients were essentially sitting in the dark. We actually saw that from our actigraph device because it also measured light. And the amount of bright light that these patients was getting amounted to about a minute a day, just 1 minute of bright light a day. And so we thought, okay, what if we increase light exposure? Will that then help sleep? And it did. The bottom line was it did. We were able to consolidate sleep, not a lot, but enough that that people in nursing homes and started actually thinking about increasing light exposure in the common areas. And at the same time, letting the bedrooms be dark at night. You know, it was a big deal. The nurses or nursing staff would open the door and the light would come in, or they would turn lights on to check on the patient. So we started educating nursing home administrators about how important darkness is at night and increased light exposure is during the day.
And to people who may not be familiar, can you explain why light and sleep disturbances occur?
Sure. So light is the strongest cue that our body has to know when to go to sleep and when to wake up. It's the strongest, what we call Zeitgeber, or cue to strengthen our circadian rhythms, our biological clock. And so bright light exposure during the day is really important. In fact, morning bright light is the most important, which is why those of us in the field are always fighting for permanent standard time rather than daylight savings, because we want that morning light. That's what's important. Evening light is less important for general health, actually. But anyway, so that's why light is so important. It has to do with the brain. It has to do with our production of melatonin, our secretion of melatonin, which is a hormone, which also helps in sleep. Not the melatonin you buy over the counter, but we actually produce it in our brain. And so light is one of the most important things we can do for improving sleep and strengthening our circadian rhythms. And this will become important later when I talk about my other line of research, which was in cancer, which of course you and I worked on together.
Absolutely.
So anyway, so we showed that, and as part of that, and looking at sleep apnea in that group, I became interested in the relationship between cognitive function, dementia, and sleep apnea. Because in sleep apnea, you're not getting oxygen to your brain at night, and that's got to affect cognition. And most of the patients at the nursing home, of course, had Alzheimer's disease. Some more severe than others. And we showed that there was a very strong relationship between sleep apnea and dementia. The more severe the sleep apnea, the more severe the dementia, and vice versa. So the next important study that is really, I think, part of my legacy was treating sleep apnea. Now I had moved out of the nursing home for this, but taking patients who had mild to moderate sleep apnea, or mild to moderate Alzheimer's and had sleep apnea, treating their sleep apnea to see what it would do to their cognition. And so first of all, we were able, and it was a placebo-controlled study. We had the placebo group was a mask. So the treatment for sleep apnea is called CPAP, continuous positive airway pressure. It's a mask that people wear that pushes positive pressure through the airway, which keeps the airway open during the night, because during an apnea, the airway is collapsing, and that's why people can't breathe. So our placebo group was a mask with holes in it, and we called it CRAP instead of CPAP. Affectionately called it CRAP, not in our publications, but anyway, what we showed was that 3 weeks of CPAP treatment improved sleep. They slept deeper, had less awakenings during the night. They were less sleepy during the day. Of course, they had less apnea, but they also had some slight improvement in their cognitive function. And we were able to follow some of them for 6 months, some that continued using the CPAP and some that did not. And what we showed was those that continued using it had a slower deterioration. We're not curing Alzheimer's disease here, but we slowed down the deterioration. And I think what we were really doing is, if this is the baseline of cognitive function in Alzheimer's, and then you put sleep apnea on top of it because they're not breathing, it brings their baseline down. By treating the sleep apnea, we just sort of brought them back up to a more normal baseline. And I've been involved in a lot of large epidemiological studies since. I've collaborated with a lot of people. And we showed in some of these larger studies that sleep apnea is a definite risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease. So that, worked very nicely with the data and with our results.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
So that was the aging part of my life.
Yes. And then you mentioned the cancer part of your research life.
Yeah. So the company that I worked with that made the actigraphs that we were using was called Ambulatory Monitoring. And the president, CEO of that company, Bill Gruen, used to come visit me often. Their company there was back in New York. And he always had this briefcase full of articles that were just falling out. And he came one day and he said, "We need to study sleep and cancer." And he showed me these papers from Francis Levy in Paris, who showed that if you time chemotherapy to someone's circadian rhythm, you could give higher doses with fewer side effects. And I thought, wow, that's pretty impressive, but we know so little about circadian rhythms in cancer. Let's take a step back. And so again, I was one of the first to study patients with breast cancer, but to start studying them before they began their chemotherapy. Every other study had either been done in survivors or during chemo. And for me, I felt like, how can I understand what's going on during chemo if I don't know what was going on before? I can't blame it on the cancer or the chemotherapy if we don't have that baseline. Now, obviously, the baseline is after diagnosis. So it is still possible that it may have been different before, but who knows when the cells start mutating? The only point you can get is a diagnosis. So the first study we did, I think, was just looking at how sleep and rhythms change from baseline during, I think we looked at cycle 1 and cycle 4 of chemo. Yes. And yeah, and then not after, that was it. Those were, and again, we did it with actigraphy. They wore the actigraphs for 72 hours because that allowed us to also look at rhythms as well as sleep. And we did, I think, about 60 patients, 60 women. And we showed that several things happened. First of all, that many of the women had disrupted sleep, depression, and reported poor quality of life even before they started their chemotherapy. Now, again, whether that was a result of the cancer, the stress, we don't know why, but it was definitely there. And the more symptoms they had pre-chemo, the worse they did during chemo. So I think that was really an important finding. But everybody got worse during chemo. Sleep definitely got worse. Mood, depression got worse. Quality of life was worse. Everything was worse during chemo. And so I can't remember what order we did these in, but that led to a treatment study where we used bright light because, as I just explained, bright light synchronizes rhythms. It helps sleep. We thought, okay, can we improve the circadian rhythms? And the reason that's important is because in these large epidemiological studies that I mentioned I was involved in, we had shown that disrupted rhythms increase the risk, first of all, increase the risk of cancer, dementia, heart disease, death. Disrupted rhythms don't go along well with good health. So, and we knew how to fix rhythms. We've done it before in other things, but no one had ever looked at the relationship between rhythms and fatigue. And of course, fatigue is one of the biggest symptoms that cancer patients have. And so I thought, well, the symptoms are so similar to the symptoms in other disorders. Let's see what light will do to fatigue. And so we did this light study. Again, we had a control group that had dim red light, which should have no effect, or we used it as a comparison group. Could have a slight effect, but probably not as much. And then the bright white light group. And we had them sit in front of the light box every morning for 30 minutes. We had baseline recordings, and then we did it again for cycle 1 and cycle 4. Except this time the regimen for chemo had changed. So it was actually now a 2-week regimen instead of 3-week. When you're doing clinical research, this is a lesson for everyone listening. Things change. You have to go with whatever is happening in the clinical work, and you have to be flexible, still being true to your science, but there has to be some flexibility there. Anyway, the bottom line is we showed that while the bright light didn't improve fatigue, which is what I thought it did, it kept it from getting worse. And I thought, I'll take that. If I can keep the fatigue from getting worse in these patients, that's a win. So I don't know how many people are actually doing it out in the clinical work. It got a good response when we would present the data. We kept fatigue from getting worse. We improved sleep. We improved circadian rhythms. So light was quite effective. And I retired right at the point when the next study I wanted to do was to see if we could do a combination of treating the sleep specifically with what we call cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia and light at the same time, and to actually start the treatment before the women started chemo to see if we could really keep things from getting worse. That didn't get funded, got a great score, but didn't get funded. And then I retired for personal reasons, just because I retired. But I had colleagues at Mount Sinai in New York who really caught on to this work, and they continued doing it, and I was able to collaborate with them. They did it more in survivors, but they also showed that bright light treatment improved fatigue and sleep in survivors who were still experiencing it. And the last thing I'll say is the last study we did was a 1-year study where we looked at, specifically, we're looking at cognition at what was at the time called chemo brain. I don't think it's called that anymore, but it's essentially cognitive problems that women, and now we know men as well, but we were studying women with breast cancer, often complained of very serious cognitive problems as a result of the chemotherapy. And so we followed women for 1 year. And what we learned was that the best predictor of cognitive impairment was really disrupted circadian rhythms, of fatigue, of cognition, of really all the variables that we were studying. Having poor rhythms is what most predicted these negative effects. And so again, it's so easy to use bright light to keep the rhythms from being disrupted or improve them, that it's really something that should be done for all patients.
But you didn't have a chance to follow that 1-year study up with an intervention. Yes.
We did not, unfortunately. No, and no one's done that either.
Your body of research has been recognized in so many ways. For the past 3 years, if I recall correctly, you've been identified as one of the 1,000 top female research scientists throughout the world, and #1 at UCSD, based upon number of publications, if I recall correctly.
No, based on number of citations.
Number of citations
So
of
it's
your work.
how
Right,
often
right.
my work is cited. Yeah,
Yes,
I have to say that the first year that happened, 3 years ago, was the first, which is also the first time they ever ranked the women's, right? Because up to then it'd been men or a combination. I was shocked, truly shocked, honored, but shocked to learn that I was #1 at UCSD. We have so many wonderful, amazing women scientists here. The fact that I was #1 just truly blew me away. And I think the reason I have so many citations, yes, I have a lot of publications. I think I have 575 publications or something, but it's because of all the collaborative work that I did. I think it's so important to collaborate. I had the work in my laboratory, which was very productive, but I also worked with other people. You know, when you have areas where you can offer help, where you can collaborate and do, first of all, it's a lot of fun to work with a lot of different people, but it also moves the science forward. And I think it's in part because of all my collaborations that I'm cited so much. But
well, and also
one at UCSD, and my ranking went down a little bit in the world and in the country this 3rd year, but given that I've been retired 12 years, I'm still in the top 150 in the world and in the US. So
amazing.
I'm pretty proud. I'm pretty proud.
Congratulations. Also, it may well reflect the diverse fields that you contributed to within sleep research. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in addition to that honor, you've had many other honors. Can you comment on which were especially meaningful to you?
Yeah, again, I don't want to boast, but I've won every major award in my field. Each one shocked me that I was recognized. The first one was a Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Sleep Foundation. At which point I thought, wait, if I'm getting a Lifetime Achievement, does that mean I get to retire? This was way before I thought about retiring. It turns out the answer is no, you don't. The Dement Award, named after Bill Dement, who was one of the fathers of our field, that was incredibly meaningful. The Mary Carskadden Education Award. When I was president of the Sleep Research Society, I started that award. We had been recognizing investigators, researchers. We had never recognized educators. And so I started this award, and Mary Carskadden, who is at Brown, is one of the most incredible educators. She trained so many students. And so she was the first recipient, and we named the award after her. Bill Dement was the second person to get that award, and I was the third. And so, I'm incredibly proud of that one, because being a mentor, being a teacher is a big part of who I am, right? I mentioned how some of my research is my legacy, but I really feel like my true legacy are my students. my graduate students, my postdocs who have gone on to be major players in the field in their own right. One of them was just president of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, and they're all just major figures in the field, and that's what I'm really the most proud of. But yeah, I got a bunch of awards. They're all, I mean, each one is meaningful, and in every thank you that I gave for the awards, I said what I just said about my students, because it's because of them that I could do the work that I did, right? We don't work in a vacuum. Without our graduate students and our postdocs, we would never be as productive as we end up being.
Absolutely, absolutely. It takes a village to.
It takes a village, exactly. That's right.
So outside your normal extensive accomplishments in research at UCSD, were you active in campus organizations? And then I know you've had an extensive list of community service activities, and perhaps you could then comment on those leadership positions.
Yeah. I was on faculty council for many years. I can't even remember now. I was on a bunch of different committees. It's funny how you forget that. I'd have to look at my CV and see and look up. I think I've actually taken it off my CV at this point. So yeah, I was, I mean, you know, it's part of what we do in academia. We're supposed to be on committees. Faculty council was really interesting. I learned a lot about the campus and what goes on, medical school versus campus, that kind of thing. So I did my fair share of committee work at the university. But I was also very active outside of the university in leadership roles outside of the field. So I mentioned I was president of the Sleep Research Society. I was on the executive board of the National Sleep Foundation when we were first starting that. So different things within my field, but within the community, I also felt it was really important to give back. And I sat on executive boards primarily at Jewish agencies, at the Jewish Community Center, Hillel, the San Diego Jewish Academy, at my synagogue, Congregation Bethel. I was president there. Actually, as I was retiring, I was president there. And now I'm still active in the Jewish Federation of San Diego. And I like giving back. It's a very rewarding thing to do.
So Sonia, how did you do it all? I know you had a wonderful family life. You had this incredible research career, and you were incredibly active in the community in leadership positions. So how did you do it all?
I don't know, maybe not well. You know, I used to say this to my graduate students a lot. Yes, you got to learn how to juggle. But B, most important is you have to set a priority. You have to, even before you start having a family, you got to set your priorities. And I knew for me, my priority was always going to be my family. So when I started having children, we have 2 children who are now grown and each have 2 children. But when I started having children, I went part-time, which was actually a big mistake, which I didn't realize till I was getting ready to retire. Because when you work part-time, you only earn part-time credit towards retirement. And it turns out when you're an academic, it's harder if you're a clinician, but if you're an academic, you get to go home when you want anyway, right? But I felt too guilty. I don't know if that's part of being a woman or what, but I felt like I had to work harder and do more than the men did, which I think at the time we did have to do to prove ourselves. And so I worked part-time, and I would pick my kids up from preschool or whatever, and I'd go home, and as soon as they went to sleep, I would turn the computer back on again at home and continue working. And I actually was working full-time, just getting paid half-time and then 3/4 time. I worked hard. What my family always came first, but what I did give up was anything for me. I didn't go to exercise classes. I didn't get manicures. You know, I didn't do anything for me. It was all about my family and my work. And just to give you an example, this is something my children have never forgiven me for. I was invited to be on Oprah, and I turned it down. And I turned it down because it meant I would have had to miss my daughter being in a math competition. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to miss that. And she came in first place. So wasn't I glad that I was there? So that's what I mean by, you set your priorities, and when a conflict comes up, it's easy to make the decision because it's important. I mean, sometimes you can't. Sometimes work had to come first. But in general, that helped me balance and remember what was important to me.
So Sonia, you just shared with us an important lesson learned about concept of part-time versus full-time, especially in a non-clinical environment where you're not faced with patients 8 or 10 hours a day, where you can be flexible as to when you do the work. Were there other lessons learned during your long career?
That was an important one, by the way. And I told all my female students and junior colleagues, don't ever go part-time. There's absolutely no reason. I mean, the men left at 3 o'clock anyway, right? There's no reason I couldn't as well. Other lessons learned. So when I first started in the psychiatry department, I was thinking about this before and getting ready for this. I think there were maybe 3 women, maybe 2 of us. I can't remember. It was a very small number. And we did have to work harder, but we also really supported each other. And as more women came in, Sandy Brown came into the department, Terry Jernigan came into the department. I was more senior to them, but we really supported each other. We would have monthly luncheons where we would talk about anything from where do you get your haircut to how do you write your letter for your reviews, and everything in between. So being supportive of your fellow colleagues, whether it's men or women, is really important. You want them to support and help you, and you want to be able to support and help them.
So creating a community within your work environment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think there's something about being a woman having, we don't have, especially if you're a junior faculty with a male, you're working with male colleagues, you need women around you because it's different for us. I mean, men work really hard and they can be fathers and have responsibilities as well. And it's, I think, more and more true these days, but there's still something different about being a woman professional. And so I think that's really important to have that that connection and that group to lean on.
And in that context, did you have female role models, both in the research environment, in the clinical environment, or in the outside of professional venues environment?
Not really, because I was so senior to everybody. When I started, as I said, there were very few women. Mary Karskanen and I would, work hard at getting, and there were other women too, but getting women onto panels and into our, to get to speak at our meetings and stuff. Female role models.
So it sounds like you were one of the women who was blazing the trail.
I was trying. Yeah. I mean, I've been in the field about 45 years. So, yeah.
Well, and think of—
hopefully I've been a role model for others.
Think of all the role models you have served for others. You've been a role model to so many of your trainees, your postdocs, your junior faculty over the years, not just at UCSD, but through all your meeting activities as well. Yeah.
I did have, I mean, Chris Gillen was a role model. He was such a good, kind man. But yeah, there weren't a lot. Here's another lesson, by the way. You asked me about lessons.
Yes.
I remember I was working with someone else's administrative assistant for some reason, probably collaborating. And she did something for me and I said, thank you. And she looked at me in shock and she said, you were the first person that's ever thanked me. And I looked at her and I said, are you kidding? And it turns out that a lot of our colleagues don't use those 2 words. And I think it's so important to recognize everyone that you work with, not just your bosses, not just the chairs of the department, but everybody. Be kind to people. I think that's a really important lesson too.
Totally agree. Absolutely. From the person who greets you as you walk in the building, who's been working overnight to make sure everything is clean, to your boss who you meet with the next day. Thank everyone and be kind. Yes.
Exactly right. Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned you retired about
12 years
12
ago.
years ago.
12
So
years.
what have you been doing since retirement?
Well, at the beginning, my husband and I did a lot of travel, sort of getting in as much as we could. And then COVID hit. So I did nothing. A lot of Zoom meetings. At that point, I had stopped seeing patients, but I was still collaborating. I was still collaborating. So I still had some meetings and stuff like that. And then once the world opened up, for the first 2 years, I started traveling like crazy again. I was gone more than I was home, because I didn't know how to fill up my time up any other way. You know, I'd worked my whole life. My husband was ill. I took care of him. He passed away. And so suddenly it's like, how do I fill my time? What do I do? And so I filled it with travel, which is not a bad thing, but it was a little overdone. And so this past year, I've learned how to be home and how to like being home. I do more exercise classes. I do more social things. I learned how to play mahjong. I always thought, I am so not that person. Turns out I am so that person. It's a lot of fun and it's a great social thing to do. As I said, I'm very involved in the Jewish Federation of San Diego. That keeps me quite busy. So yeah, combination and my grandchildren. I have 4 grandchildren. I am so blessed that they're all in San Diego. So I get to spend time with them as well.
Phenomenal, phenomenal. Anything we haven't discussed that you would like to cover in this interview?
You know, within our field, in fact, Mary Cascadno, I keep mentioning, she was the editor of a somewhat new journal that we have called Sleep Advances. And she started a section called Living Legends, because we were losing so many of our older founding members. And I was an associate editor on that section. I just stepped down the end of last year, but and it's exactly like what you're doing, except it's in writing instead of being a video. And they just got to me. So I actually just finished writing my Living Legends paper. And so that helped me get ready for this as well. But no, I think we've covered my life. You know, I love photography. I'm going to put it out there. I have a travel blog. Anyone wants to check it out, it's journeyswithsonia.com. It's got my photographs and stories. And if you like it, you can sign up. And when I do post something, you'll get an email, which is not often. So you will never be overwhelmed with emails. But I still love to travel. I still love to document it with my photographs. I love going into places that are different than us, you know, different cultures, different food, people that dress differently. So I'm going to try to keep doing that.
Wonderful, wonderful. I did think of another question. How has UCSD changed since the late 70s when you arrived?
Well, it's a lot bigger. You know, when I go on the main campus, sometimes all these new buildings, I can barely find my way around. It's grown in stature as well as physically grown. There are many more women now, which is wonderful. Parking is worse. That's the bad, along with it comes with growth. You know, I've been out of it for so long, even though I still collaborate and work. I mean, I don't have an office. I don't go to campus that much anymore. And so I'm really out of the loop. But I think people, from what I can see, there's still a lot of collaboration that goes on, which is great. and the fact that it's grown so much and there are new departments and many more people. So there's a lot more ability or opportunity for collaborations and for growing each of the fields. And I think because we've gotten so much bigger, that's also gotten much easier and better. Probably has grown and changed in a lot of other ways that I'm just not seeing anymore.
Great, great, great. Well, you clearly have been a living legend at UC San Diego and throughout the world in your sleep research. And we are so grateful to you that you allowed us to interview you today and to record your story for posterity and learn your lessons that you learned over your long career.
Thank you. Thank you for including me and for giving me this honor.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And we hope that you continue to contribute in so many ways as you are currently.
Thanks, Barbara.
Bye-bye.
Bye.